Good afternoon. My name is Tom Glazier, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to the New America Foundation to discuss how telecommunications was shaped in its early years and what the relevance might be for us in 2010. For those of you watching on the web, New America is a public policy institute that looks to new ideas and new thinkers to address the next generation of challenges facing the United States. A mission we embrace through 15 programs that cover everything from counterterrorism to education and economic growth, both here in DC and in California. I lead our work on media policy as part of a team housed in New America's Open Technology Initiative, where we have been considering how the changing media and technological landscape affects citizens' participation in democracy. As the Knight Report on Sustaining Democracy in a Digital Age, the report we are using as our starting point, reads, promoting engagement means generating opportunities and motivation for involvement. Thus, our approach to our work is premised on the idea that individuals need three things to participate in a democratic society: relevant and credible information, the education needed to engage with that information, and opportunities to participate in the public life. Technology and telecommunications is clearly a major part of what is changing in communication in communities today. And with that in mind, and an idea that history is important, we've invited Professor Richard John here today to share some of the early history of the telegraph and telephone, given that history almost certainly has relevance for the debates today. There might just be some parallels between with the early years of the telephone and telegraph with the internet. And though it is a couple of weeks before the holidays and one might think that telecommunications regulation might be winding down, that is hardly the case, as many of us know. It is just possible that the FCC will adopt regulations that secure an open internet for the foreseeable future, or not, or conversely adopt rules that undercut that possibility, particularly on wireless. To make the bridge to the present day and those debates, we have three excellent panelists. Professor Pat Aufderheide from the American University, who runs the Center for Social Media, and, quite usefully for this panel, wrote Communications Policy in the Public Interest on the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Joining her is Sasha Meinrath, my colleague, who leads the New America's Open Technology Initiative, who has written a number of significant, more future-focused articles on telecommunications regulation. And finally, Andrew Schwartzman, Policy Director at the Media Access Project, who I can describe only as a DC legend, having worked on telecommunications regulation at Media Access since Garfield made his debut in a cartoon, and I will leave you to guess when that was. In short, we have some fine minds to focus on the historical lessons of early telecommunications, regulation in the present day, and we intend to use them. In terms of the program, we will have a presentation from Richard John, after which we will have a panel discussion with all four of our participants. But before I start, I need to mention that this event is being live streamed on the web, and everything is on the record forever, or at least until Google, or if we want to be up to the present day, or WikiLeaks can find it. For those of you on Twitter, please use the hashtag #NAFevent. We will keep an eye on your questions and incorporate them in the Q&A. And without further delay, and wanting to leave time for some less formal conversation over drinks after the panel, I'd like to thank you all for coming and ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Richard John.
Thank you, Tom, for that very gracious introduction. I've admired the work of New Foundation for some time, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to be here in person. The United States has long boasted an impressive array of facilities for circulating information regularly and reliably over vast distances and high speed. By 1840, the mail linked thousands of localities in a single countrywide network, while line-of-sight or optical telegraphs hastened ship-to-shore communication in several of the country's largest seaports. And by 1920, the United States had become integrated into a global telegraph network and boasted the world's largest and most intensively patronized federation of telephone exchanges. So telecommunications, our dominant position, or at least our important position, is nothing new. The telegraph and telephone exerted a far-reaching influence on American life. The telegraph established new conventions of simultaneity, and the telephone severed the age-old link between propinquity and the spoken word. By 1920, the two media had become the central nervous system of the city. The influence of the telegraph and the telephone in American society is well known. Yet often overlooked is the influence of American society on the telegraph and the telephone. And that's the theme of the book that I've written, Network Nation. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. In the years between 1840 and 1920, the proposition that the entire population had a right to a certain basic level of telegraph and telephone service was the subject of a long and sometimes acrimonious public debate. In 1840, almost no one anticipated that the entire population might one day communicate electrically by wire. Yet by 1920, few doubted that the operators of the nation's telegraph and telephone networks had a social responsibility to provide the entire population with facilities to send a telegram across the continent or to make a local telephone call. So the idea of access was across the nation for the telegraph, inside the municipality for the telephone. How and why did the telegraph and telephone shift from a specialty service for an exclusive clientele to a mass service for the entire population? The answer to this question involves an exploration not only of technology and economics, but also of politics and culture. So I'm interested in the political foundations and the cultural values that have shaped the development of communication networks. Though the telegraph and the telephone differed in many ways, each evolved through three stages. In the first stage, commercialization, the network was established. In the second stage, popularization, the network was scaled up from a specialty service into a mass service. And in the third stage, naturalization, the network was depoliticized through the constant repetition of the seductive dogma that existing institutional arrangements were rooted in technology and economics rather than in politics and culture. The telephone was commercialized in the 1870s, popularized around 1900, and naturalized during the First World War. In the case of the telegraph, the sequencing of the second and third stages was reversed. The telegraph was commercialized in the 1840s, naturalized in the 1880s, and popularized in 1910. Throughout much of human history, political, religious, and military leaders have labored mightily, often with considerable success, to prevent ordinary people from securing access to information about the wider world. The founders of the United States chose a different path. If the people were sovereign, as the federal Constitution proclaimed, then it seemed indisputable that the government had an obligation to provide the people with regular broadcasts on public affairs from the seat of power. No longer was access to this information a privilege, rather it now became a right, or more precisely, a practical necessity for a government whose legitimacy rested in the sovereignty of the people. The mail, as one lawmaker declared in 1792, had been established for no other purpose than the conveyance of information into every part of the Union. And that claim that the circulation of information was foundational to the Republic is going to be the basis for the slide presentation I'm going to give you now, which is going to take us through the argument of the book in visual form, or at least those dimensions of it that are the most salient. And I want to start, if the clicker is going to work, right here in New York City. Can we get the lights down a little bit? Is that possible? Or do we do it? New York City in 1875. This is one of the biggest buildings in the city, thank you, Tom, which was the post office. And on Broadway, today 195 Broadway, even taller building, which was the headquarters of Western Union. Recently completed, then the tallest, most massive building in the city, most expensive real estate transaction. And they obeyed different mandates. The post office had a civic mandate to provide access, information to the entire population. The mandate of the Western Union was much narrower. It was to provide access to information for those who could pay, for the business elite. Where are these institutions? There's the Western Union building, huge structure, long since torn down, replaced by what's now 195 Broadway along the AT&T headquarters, just as the Christian churches supplanted the pagan temples, so AT&T felt it necessary to tear down the Western Union building and build their own headquarters. And where was this all? There's a 19th century map of New York City. There's City Hall. There's City Hall, sorry. There's the post office. And there's the Western Union building. Or let's look at it on a present-day map. That's what we're talking about. That's where the post office was, now a park, and that's where the Western Union building was. So that's the drama. There are two different mandates. There's a civic mandate and a commercial mandate. Now, it's important to keep in mind just how big this institution, the post office, was. Look at the revenue. Western Union operating revenue was never more than about a third post office revenue, not until 1920. As the Bell system operating revenue exceed that of the post office department. And I just want to keep that in mind because it was very much in the mind of 19th century contemporaries. That is to say, I'm telling the story of telecommunications going forward from the early republic. Most other scholars, including most recently Tim Wu, whose master switch is on display in the other room, tend to tell the story backward from the present. And as a historian, I find that unsatisfying. I want to talk about what came before, and one of the institutions that was very important was the post office. Second institution is one we've almost entirely forgotten, which was the French Optical Telegraph, which is the beginning of telecommunication in the 1790s. Did this matter? Well, I show this to my students. That's how big the optical telegraph network was in France at its peak. Several thousand people employed, hundreds of stations, all centered around Paris. It was not like the United States, a decentralized information infrastructure. It was a very centralized information infrastructure. Did Americans remember it? Well, in the 1870s, a popular cartoonist could write about Love's Telegraph, which is a fickle young girl with her telegraph bureau on her head with her different moods. And yes, it was certainly well known to AT&T, the telephone giant, early 20th century. The first long-distance system was Napoleon's visual telegraph. So the mail and optical telegraph are two networks that are very much in the mind of contemporaries when the electric telegraph is first commercialized in the 1840s. The key figure in the commercialization of the electric telegraph is a fellow by the name of Amos Kendall, who had been Postmaster General in the 1830s. He became the business agent for the holder of the telegraph patent rights, Samuel Morse, in the 1840s. And his idea for the commercialization of the telegraph was slavishly modeled on the idea that he developed in the 1830s for a horse express. Kendall was firmly committed, as you see here, that this is an 1837 cartoon, that the horse would supplant the railroad as a high-speed medium, because it had the great advantage as a high-speed medium that it would circulate only certain information. That is to say, he did not want newspapers circulating indiscriminately throughout the country by telegraph, because he feared if there was a nationwide discussion of controversial issues, that would threaten vested interests. And he was particularly concerned about a nationwide discussion of the slavery issue. So though a Northerner, we see him here reading Virginia newspaper, the Richmond Enquirer. His original plan for Morse's telegraph modeled on this plan for a horse express in which you would have circulation of news through the telegraph, but not opinion. Opinion would remain a local, a divide that he regarded as important to the perpetuation of the Union. Well, let's fast forward a little bit to 1872. This is a highly idealized image of the electric telegraph. It actually was put first in a tourist brochure. Here we have Star of Empire on the forehead of this goddess. She is floating above the settlers going west. In her left hand is a telegraph wire. In the right hand is a school book. This is an idealized image of the telegraph that was very much at variance with the reality. For in fact, the telegraph was developed in the United States under circumstances that did not favor a single monopoly, but in fact just the opposite. Amos Kendall and Samuel Morse wanted desperately to sell the patent rights for the telegraph to Congress so that the telegraph could be administered like the post office department as a government monopoly. Well, it didn't happen that way. And one of the reasons it didn't happen that way Congress wasn't interested. Another, it would have threatened a lot of vested interests who were troubled by the idea of a single centralized communications network. And among them were editors of the New York newspapers who were fearful that if the telegraph was under the control of a single group of promoters, that the telegraph would be used in a way disadvantageous to them. These New York editors lobby the New York State Legislature to enact a law in 1848, the New York Telegraph Act of 1848. And what that law does is it makes it very easy to establish telegraph operating companies to rival the telegraphic operating companies backed by Morse's patent rights. And you can read about this in the book in more detail. The basic point here, for purposes of discussion today, is that the telegraph emerged in an anti-monopoly regulatory regime in which the presumption was we were going to have a large number of network providers, and that would be advantageous to the New York press because the New York press would not be confronted with a single hostile network provider, but instead with a number, and it would be easier for them to negotiate. By the 1870s, the New York press had, in fact, succeeded in establishing a trade association, the New York Associated Press, not to be confused with the present Associated Press, but it was a predecessor, that gave them and certain other favored newspapers preferential access to news dispatches. Not all newspapers, but only certain newspapers. And they actually wrote into the law, the New York lawmaker, who happened to be a newspaper editor, that the press would get preferential access to telegraphic news. So not only are they able to band together, but in order to limit the power of network providers, but they're also banded together in order to get themselves special privileges. Needless to say, perhaps, this policy, preferential privileges for certain editors, buttressed by Associated Press, which had a close relationship with Western Union, was not viewed favorably by those editors not so lucky to have access to this information. And this cartoon shows, it's a little confusing, this is the president of Western Union, which emerged after the Civil War as the dominant network provider, and he has the lightning in his left hand, and he is stomping on the press. Not all editors, but the press, the editor of the Daily Graphic is particularly concerned about are those editors who do not have access to the AP feed, because Western Union, after the Civil War, has come to work very closely with these New York newspapers to form a close alliance. Congress responds in 1866 by enacting a Telegraph Act that was meant to promote competition, rivalry, nationwide, just as the New York Telegraph Act of 1848 was intended to promote competition at the state level. And I think of these two acts as somewhat analogous to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was intended to promote competition, as I understand the intentions of the founders. But in the case of the 1848 Telegraph Act in New York, 1866 National Telegraph Act, and arguably the 1996 Act as well, the opposite happened. It fostered consolidation. And you have the emergence of a small number of telegraph network providers, including Western Union, develop very close relationship with the Associated Press, much to the distress of those newspapers that are not part of the monopoly. The same editor asks a question, and it's a good question in this year. The two figures here are Uncle Sam, the government, who stands for government control of the communication network, and Jay Gould, who at this time is a upstart rival of Western Union. And the question, who has his own telegraph network. And it looks like Jay Gould may be in a position to expand the size of the network. And the caption is Uncle Sam saying to Jay Gould, "So you're the fellow that's to run all the railroads and telegraphs and things. Well, there's no accounting for taste. Our folks were dreadful afraid I was going to do it, and now they've pitched on you." That is to say, there was a nationwide debate in the United States in the 1860s and 70s about whether or not the federal government would own and operate the telegraph. British government took over its telegraph network. This time, French network was government owned and operated. Why not the United States? The response was, no, we're going to promote anti-monopoly. But by the mid-1870s, there's a lurking suspicion that anti-monopoly might lead, horror of horrors, to the control of the network by someone like Jay Gould, who was the most unscrupulous promoter of them all. He was not yet in control of the network, but it was recognized that that was a possibility. This rivalry between Jay Gould and Western Union in the 1870s is, I think, worth pausing about for a moment, because it was this rivalry between these two network providers which are operating in a regulatory regime that is meant to encourage competition. It helped to spawn, their rivalry helped to spawn an entrepreneurial hothouse that led in short order to four of the defining technological innovations of the 19th century. And what were these innovations? Well, they were broadband telegraph, telephone, phonograph, and electric power and light. All four of these innovations were spawned by inventors who were trying to sell them either to Western Union, Jay Gould, or were using the money that they had acquired in the course of that act to innovate in themselves. So the key figures, Edison and Bell, emerge. In Tim Wu's Master Switch, he contends that the playing field was level, and that if it hadn't been level, if it had been rigged, we might not have had an Edison or a Bell. Well, the playing field was rigged. It was rigged in favor of inventors because we had a very strong intellectual property regime that made it possible for them to, in effect, extort either Western Union or Gould. We have a brief moment of extraordinary creativity. So we have these two different principles: strong property rights for inventors through the patent system, very weak property rights for network providers because of the presumption of anti-monopoly. The story gets a little more complicated when it's recognized that Jay Gould is using his control of this opposition telegraph network to manipulate the financial press, and in particular to manipulate the price of Western Union shares. Here we have Jay Gould flying his journalistic kites. These are the prominent New York editors, immediately recognizable to the New York readership, standing on top of Western Union. He does not yet control Western Union, but he's dabbling in Western Union shares, and on top of the tower of the New York Tribune. And the point here is that if you have this kind of power over newspapers and telegraph, that you can manipulate share prices of the major industrials, telegraph and railroad. You're in a very good position if you know which way the share price is going to go, because if it's going to go up, you buy the shares. If it's going to go down, you sell short. And Gould knew which way it was going to go because he had his own network and because he had his own lobbyists who were influencing congressional legislation. An awful lot of the bills to regulate the telegraph in the 1870s and 80s were sponsored surreptitiously by promoters who recognized that they could shape the price of the shares in the network themselves by floating those bills. So if you think that it was complex and there was a lot of collusion and dirty dealing going on, you're absolutely right. The cartoonist goes on to say, well, we don't need a Statue of Liberty, which was then being promoted. This is a suggestion for the Franco-American Society. Just have Jay Gould astride the two islands with the New York Tribune Tower in his hand. Gould remains at this time in opposition, and there still is the hope that anti-monopoly legislation can prevent someone like Gould from dominating the network. And that's very much the aspiration of the cartoonist who penned this cartoon. This is a forgotten piece of legislation, but it's a sort of interesting piece of legislation. 1879, Army Appropriations Bill, they stick on a rider, which becomes known as the Butler Amendment. The Butler Amendment is named for the Massachusetts Congressman Ben Butler, the Beast of New Orleans, who it turns out is surreptitiously lobbyist for Jay Gould. But that's not what's widely recognized at the time. It's recognized at the time that this is going to be an anti-monopoly bill. It makes it possible for any telegraph company to get easy access to railroad right-of-way by breaking the exclusive contracts that Western Union had with railroads. That was the hope, the aspiration, because that was the way that Western Union is able to buttress its power in an anti-monopoly political economy through exclusive right-of-way agreements, which are hard to break in the courts, dubious legally, but hard to break in the courts. And here we have Liberty. She's going to destroy the relationship between the news monopoly, which is Western Union and the Associated Press. Why do they have a monopoly? What's in it for Western Union? Well, Western Union is an extraordinarily unpopular institution. So what does it give the Associated Press? It gives it the promise that it's not going to criticize it in the press. This is often written into contracts. There'll be no criticism of Western Union in AP feeds. What does AP get? Extraordinarily low rates, all right, for the newspaper editors. So it's a nice deal. The idea is we're going to break this with the Butler Amendment by encouraging new competition in the telegraph business. And who's the only one who complains? The new president of Western Union, whose by the name is Orton, and the widows and orphans. And of course, who are the widows and orphans? Well, it was a big joke for the New York audience because that was immediately recognizable as the leading fat cats of the day: Edwin Morgan, Augustus Schell, William Vanderbilt. In other words, the only people who would invest in telegraph shares at this time were speculators or insiders. You'd be nuts to invest in it if you didn't know what was going on. The hope is anti-monopoly will save the day, or at least that's the way it's being portrayed in the press. And that was the ostensible intent of the Butler Amendment. Well, goodness gracious, what happens is almost precisely the opposite. And it may well be that Gould knew all along that this was going to be the outcome. January 1881, New York, newspaper reading, magazine reading, public awakes. January 1881, Jay Gould has gained control of Western Union. That is to say, he now controls the 3 telegraph networks in the United States, and that puts him in a position, well, according to the cartoonist, the very talented Vienna-born cartoonist Joseph Kepler, to strangle the press, right, and to strangle commerce. And it's Satan, Jay Gould as Satan, and in his pocket are the 2 newspapers that he controls, the Tribune and the World. And insiders are keeping an eye on how many newspapers Gould controls, because if you control 4 New York City newspapers, then you control the votes on the Associated Press. A little bit like watching the FCC commissioners, which way they're going to go. If you got 4 of those chairs on the New York Associated Press, then you can control the entire organization. Another image that some of you may have seen. This is Gould. Strangulation is a common theme for control over the telegraph. Uncle Sam is being garroted here on a cross. Jesus on the cross. Gould and his ally William Vanderbilt have the World, the Tribune, and the Express. 3 of the 7 New York newspapers, and they are going to use it to dominate American business. And what happens next is even more worrisome. Gould's ally, Cyrus Field, gains control of the Mail. A 4th newspaper is threatened to, which would give them control over the New York Associated Press. This is a fascinating cartoon. The Free Press Lighthouse, the newspaper press, is making possible the channel of legitimate trade, or making possible for the ships to see what the channel of legitimate trade is, the press buoy. But if the Telegraph and the Associated Press and these 4 newspapers are controlled by Gould and Field, then you will, in effect, destroy the lighthouse, and the channel of legitimate trade will be obscured. That is the fear when Gould takes over. Once Gould takes over Western Union, anti-monopoly loses a lot of its resonance. Not all of it, but a lot of it, because the discovery is that anti-monopoly can lead to precisely the opposite outcome that had been intended. It's not going to lead to large numbers of network providers that are fierce rivals. It instead is going to lead to a single consolidated telegraph network dominated by the most despised and feared financial speculator of them all, Jay Gould. It was often simply called Mephistopheles in the press. Well, what if that future comes about? What if Jay Gould does in fact take over the New York Associated Press? Here he is, doling out the press dispatches, signed Gould, his monopoly news delivery, and there's the telegraph wires. So he controls in this vision. He never does get all 4 newspapers, and it's not really clear that he recognizes that it's in his commercial interest to do so. But if he did, he would have the Associated Press, New York newspapers, and Western Union. But there is an independent press. And this is, not surprisingly, the editor of this paper called Puck. His name, Puck. He will be watching. He will be outside. He will be trying to monitor Jay Gould. He will keep his independent news stand. The goal of Gould's speculation, this is one of the most remarkable cartoons. Many of these cartoons have never been shown before, and this is one of the most remarkable of them all. Gould is sitting inside a device that I suspect very few of you have ever seen or perhaps even heard of. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, it's a stock ticker. Okay? So he's sitting inside a stock ticker on his throne. And the caption is, "I never speculate." Well, of course, one reason he doesn't have to speculate is because he's astride Western Union. He's a major shareholder. He's right there in the Western Union building. But another reason he doesn't have to speculate, to kind of bring the point home, is that he's writing the stock prices himself. In other words, he's got such control of the network, he's able to dominate the channels of commerce. Well, what do we do about this frightening specter of Jay Gould controlling the nation's communication networks? Well, the press, the independent press, can go after him. And here's Puck and the independent editors attacking Jay Gould. And in case you didn't get the point, there's Jay Gould himself, if you turn your head on your side. And there are his allies, Cyrus Field and Vanderbilt, destroying legitimate commerce, this huge monopoly, unregulated, because the presumption was anti-monopoly is the only regulatory apparatus that you need. Well, that's one solution. Another solution is to go to the federal government. The best remedy, says the Democratic-leaning Puck, is to establish an anti-monopoly telegraph company. That is to say, we're going to have a new kind of it's a company that will be monitoring Western Union because it'll be able to keep a track of prices, we'll know what prices should be, and we're going to have competition. It'll be a yardstick in the verbiage used for electric power. Well, that's one regulatory outcome. Another regulatory outcome is for the government, this is more or less a Republican option, the Republican, then the big government party, was for the government to take over the telegraph network and establish a government telegraph monopoly like the one in Great Britain, modeled on, well, of course, the post office. Astonishing as it might seem to us today, in the 1880s, the post office was regarded as more technologically progressive than the telegraph. Say that again. The post office was regarded as more technologically progressive than the telegraph, which says something about what the informed insiders thought of the telegraph. And just so you get it up in all its glory, Republican-leaning mainstream newspaper, the best kind of monopoly, let the people's government supply the people's information. That was very much the presumption because the communication networks were too important to be left to the marketplace. That was the understanding of the founders. That became a mainstream understanding in the 1880s. No one believed anymore that the miracle of the marketplace could provide an adequate protection to the public in a world in which rapacious speculators like Jay Gould could get control of the communications network. There was no major telegraph legislation in the 1880s. In part because lawmakers simply could not figure out what to do. Here we have two options. Well, we could have regulation, but that would play into the hands of Tammany, New York political bosses, one source of corruption. Well, what's the alternative? Monopolyville with Vanderbilt, Gould, and Cyrus Field, and Puck just doesn't know what to do. The bigger problem, though, is that the most plausible option was for the government to buy out the telegraph. The bigger problem with this is that who would be the principal beneficiary? Well, it would be the holder of the largest number of Western Union shares. The holder of the largest number of Western Union shares was Jay Gould. Here is Kuhn. And this is the cartoonist says a new version of an old story. And Kuhn says to Uncle Sam, he says, are you in earnest, Colonel Crockett? That's, of course, Uncle Sam. Proposal for United States Telegraph. Are you in earnest, Colonel Crockett? Then don't shoot. I'll come down for $80 million. And $80 million was considered to be an outrageous sum for the purchase of the telegraph, but that was the kind of the fix that Congress was in the 1880s. The situation would not be radically transformed until 1910. The upshot was a market-based regime, anti-monopoly, gave us telegraph companies that have a very narrow mandate. They regard their mandate as providing a specialty service for an exclusive clientele. Western Union at no point aspired to provide access to the telegraph for ordinary people. The president of Western Union, 1890, said explicitly, if ordinary people want to communicate over long distances, they should send a letter. The post office is the long-distance communication medium for the masses. Even if the cost of sending a telegram were as low as the cost of sending a letter, which was extraordinarily low at that time, 2 cents, people would still prefer to use the post office because they like to see their handwriting and there's something tactile about letters. In other words, anti-monopoly, miracle of the marketplace, gave us a telegraph network that was very predicated on a very narrowly construed business strategy because of the conviction on the part of the leading firms that if they expanded their mandate, 1, they might be subject to hostile regulation, and 2, it simply wouldn't make any money. They don't have the broad civic mandate of the post office. So I contrast here the post office with its civic mandate, lots of cross-subsidies, access to the people, subsidies for newspapers. Western Union, a very different, much narrower model. Miracle of the marketplace does not fulfill the potential of the telegraph, in the eyes of many, many critics of the telegraph, including promoters connected with the new communications medium that I'd like to turn to now, which is the telephone. The telephone is commercialized in a very different political economy than the telegraph. The telephone is commercialized in a municipally based political economy in which there's a presumption that the medium will be regulated from the beginning. All right? So there was never open entry. There was never permissionless innovation in the case of the telephone, to use a contemporary phrase. Early on, the telephone evolved in a way that was roughly comparable to the telegraph. Charles N. Fay is the general manager of the Chicago Telephone Company. He states the assumption of the telephone managers who were holding the patents that had been granted to Alexander Graham Bell. He states the presumption in 1886 very well. We've reached 1/4 of 1% of the population today, he says, with our telephone, and in our wildest dreams we cannot hope to reach more than 1/2 of 1%. So this is a presumption coming from the telegraph, from the telephone business itself. The telephone will remain a specialty service for an exclusive clientele, even though it's regulated by the cities. There's no vision of the telephone becoming anything different. Who are the users of the telephone? You can see that in the next cartoon. They are businessmen. All right. Here we have the businessmen of New York City who have been trapped by the Bell telephone monopoly. The company's using trickery, extortion, bribery, goodness knows what else. It's extended its web all the way to the national capital because it has validated Alexander Graham Bell's telephone patent in it was 1888. It was extremely unpopular. That legislative decision validates the monopoly because it's going to preserve the high rates and permit the extortion by the telephone company of the business users. No assumption here of providing access to ordinary people. The issue is just business users. Well, what happens? Something remarkable does happen in the 1890s. A group of innovative telephone operating company managers in the big cities, Chicago, New York, Nashville, Tennessee, San Francisco, and several other cities, begin to try to figure out telephone economics. And here's an example. It was discovered in Chicago that the telephone is used very intensively in the morning, not much at lunch, and intensively in the afternoon. Well, what if you can begin to hire operators in accordance with this scheme? In other words, let's use data to try to improve the efficiency of the network. Well, that is with taking advantage of existing technology. The next step is actually to innovate technologically, which the Bell operating companies do. This is a common battery telephone, which in effect is taking the intelligence out of the ends of the network and putting it into the center, so you no longer have to administer the battery yourself. Though users were delighted not to have to administer the battery because it was smelly, it would get on your carpet, it was quite complicated. Now you no longer have to have a battery in your telephone, you have a common battery. Even more radical innovation, and this may be kind of hard to see, was the idea of a telephone that would have a pay mechanism. Initially, these were in drugstores, but by 1900, in certain cities, including Chicago, which was an innovator, telephone company managers discovered that it would be possible to make money by shifting the basis upon which telephone service was paid for from flat rate to measured service. So you'd actually pay per call by putting a nickel in the telephone in your own house or boarding house. By 1907, about a third of all the telephones in Chicago were metered in this way. By 1910, perhaps as many as half of all the telephones. No longer do we have flat rate. Now we have what was called by contemporaries measured service. And in the eyes of the telephone experts, and I think it's quite evident that it was the shift to measured service that popularized the telephone in the big cities because of a peculiar feature of telephone economics. If you expand the size of the telephone network, you increase the costs of providing the service. And this was a way to capture some of those costs and to make it possible economically to expand. By 1902, it's not just manufacturing, but it's a new managerial vision of the second generation, where a Chicago telephone company, a Bell operating company manager, decrees that it's the problem of telephone management to make telephone service the best and cheapest. This company believes a telephone system sufficiently comprehensive to meet the needs of a community should be prepared to supply suitable equipment and service to the small user as well as the large user at rates equitable to both. This is a remarkable change from the policy of the 1880s. Telephone companies are committing themselves to serving the small user as well as the large. Why this remarkable change? Technologically, they could have continued to make money on the old flat rate, limited usage basis, but they're under great pressure in the municipalities from city aldermen who are extorting them for large rents in order to expand their facilities. They conclude that if we expand access, we may be able to create a bigger installed base, which will give us more political clout. There were also managers who simply believe in expansion for its own sake, almost as a religion. This is a 1902 telephone advertisement right here, and it gives you the idea of the mandate of the company, the new mandate. It's the purpose of the management of this company to place telephones at the most reasonable rates within easy and immediate reach of every person whose income is sufficient to permit him to ride in streetcars, which is an awful lot of people in Chicago in 1901. In other words, the operating companies are innovating to transform the telephone into what we would today call a social medium. Nickel a day was the promise, the nominal price at which you can secure the benefit of a telephone. These ads, which make it so clear that the operating companies, the Bell operating companies, not AT&T, but the operating companies themselves, are innovating, are providing new facilities, have only become accessible to us recently with online keyword searches. Up until now, we've been relying on a different group of ads by AT&T itself, which do not feature these innovative appeals. Here, measured telephone service. This new system will bear investigation. It's the fairest for all users. You pay only for what you get. And they begin to talk about the telephone bringing companionship, books, pianos, needlework. These are sometimes diverting, but a woman craves real companionship. She loves to hear a living, laughing human voice. You get the idea. Here we have a woman who's receiving flowers. If you have a telephone, it'll help you to get a husband. There's the wedding ring. If you're able to have access, and yes, you can telephone your happiness. This is Herbert Casson, who's a Bell publicist. If you have a surplus of happiness during this Christmas season, why not telephone a part of it to someone else who has a less? And there's a great deal of this kind of advertising between about 1900 and 1910. Telegraph companies didn't want to see themselves as rivaling the mail for widespread usage. Telephone companies do. It's more economical to telephone. And that is the mandate. Well, this happy state of affairs is transformed when Bell is confronted with a series of really quite extraordinary political challenges in the 19-teens. Now, I've so far not said a word about the many rivals of Bell operating companies that emerged in the 1890s, and they're extremely important in expanding access to telephone service, especially in middle-sized towns and in rural areas. They don't do so well in the big cities, where I see the key innovations, certainly the key technical innovations, coming. These smaller firms find it advantageous under the administration of first William Howard Taft and then Woodrow Wilson to attack the Bell operating companies and AT&T, which owns the shares in many of these companies, in the courts. And they attack them in an antitrust suit. And the antitrust suit succeeds. I wanted to show you that. Sorry. It succeeds in 1913. The reason I highlighted this was that the antitrust suit is about an innovation that the president of AT&T institutes in 1910, publicizes in 1910 at least, which is universal service, conceived of as the linking of local telephone service with long-distance telegraph service. That's a bit of background you need to understand the antitrust suit. In other words, telecommunications, the vision of making electrical communications accessible to everyone, was realized in the eyes of the president of AT&T in 1910 by the linkage of the telegraph and telephone. He just bought up Western Union. It's important, since we're interested in public policy, to recognize that this linkage of telegraph and telephone was not the magnanimous response of the AT&T president, a fellow named Vail, Theodore Vail. It was not his response without a policy context. He did it after, made it public and expanded on its ambit, after the Interstate Commerce Commission had decreed that it was going to get control over the telegraph and telephone by putting them under common carrier status, and after the New York State Legislature had decreed the same. So we now have a regulatory regime in which competition is no longer going to be honored at all, and as a consequence, it's possible for the telephone manager to expand his mandate and to decree he's going to link together the telegraph and the telephone. It doesn't work out quite that way. We have an antitrust suit, and Bell is forced to divest itself of its telegraph carriers. So the vision of telecommunications linking telephone and telegraph is ended in 1913. A second challenge confronts Bell, and this is the wrap-up at this time, and that's the challenge of government ownership, which is extremely important in pushing the operating companies in innovative directions. The challenge of government ownership is very real at the municipal level and at the federal level, and the response by Bell is to innovate, and not only to innovate through long-distance telephone service with a vacuum tube, but even more importantly, to boast about their innovations and to emphasize that we are providing technological innovations that the government couldn't and that no other group of telephone network providers possibly could. The triumph of science is what the telephone company AT&T now champions. Here we have science on her forehead. This is what's bringing the country together. And I find it remarkable, almost astonishing, that the inventors that they trot out at this time, it's very cagey of AT&T, not Harold Arnold, who actually had developed the vacuum tube that made transcontinental telephone service possible, but Watson and Bell, figures who had absolutely nothing to do with the transcontinental telephone, but were very useful because, in effect, the Wilson administration says, if you want an inventor, I'll give you an inventor. If you want a garage, well, I'll give you a garage or an attic. You know, this is the kind of logic we have today, that these great innovations come about. Garages or attics. AT&T uses that as a public relations ploy in order to conceal the extent to which it's using the mantle of science to consolidate its monopoly. and I think is a lesson for more recent monopolists. This language of garages and attics and innovators on their own time creating the internet, I think, makes no more sense now than it did then, but it was great public relations then, and it may well be great public relations now. The triumph of science, that's what's on her forehead. You look back to the 1870s, at least there was a recognition that this figure, Liberty, had a political dimension. She was empire in the 1870s. You get to the 19-teens, it's science. It's been depoliticized. It's been naturalized, as it were. AT&T now, buttressed by these federal protections, expands its mandate. We are in the public service. We are a highway of communication. We are 20 million voices. This was actually just before 1910. And we're just like the post office. We're a monopoly. That's what we want to be. And we have a public service mandate. And this was made possible by the very contested regulatory environment of the 19-teens. It was also made possible by the reluctance of the lawmakers to buy out the telephone. It would be too expensive. This is what happened in Great Britain. We're not going to go down that road in the United States, and we're not going to regulate the telephone companies in a way as public utilities that would be extortionate. Remember, the power to regulate involves the obligation to protect. This is a magazine that catered to public utilities, that was very concerned about the implications of new regulations that came about in 1910, the federal government. So to conclude, AT&T manages to reinvent itself in the 19-teens as the meeting place, as this is the post office from the early republic, right? As an institution that has a civic mandate that is providing universal service, basic telephone service, cheap inside the cities. That was accomplished by 1907. Also, it's providing interconnection with the independents, those of which that are around, and there were many thousands that survived after the 19-teens. They were the big winners, really, in the 19-teens regulatory battles because they were guaranteed recognition, they were guaranteed financial stability, and indeed many of them remained with us right up to the 1980s. But this would all be under the umbrella of AT&T, which was following a civic mandate that their president, Theodore Vail, knew very well, went back to the early republic. His own business career began railway mail service in the 1870s. So we have a trajectory here in which the development of communication networks is embedded in politics and culture, but in such a way that that legacy becomes obscured and it becomes sort of reconfigured as a matter of technology and economics. And I find that to be very misleading. And I believe that if we are to be true to the visions of the founders and certainly true to the best in our heritage with regard to the telegraph and telephone, we should recognize that sensible regulation in the public interest is absolutely essential in order to make possible the remarkable promise of technological innovation that's been spawned by electrical communication. Thank you. You want me to sit here?
Yeah. I'd like to invite the other panelists to the stage. Thank you very much, Richard, for that expansive presentation on what is, if you read it in its entirety, a quite significant piece of research. I have some starting questions for the other panelists, and we'll offer them up to the panelists as something to key off, but welcome really a response to Richard's presentation in the book in any way you feel you would like. And I'll start, Andy, with yourself. You're active in the present day, and you've, as I say, been working on these issues for around 30 years. Do you have any? Can you draw parallels from the history that Richard talked about to the present day?
Well, yes and no. One of the very interesting parts of Richard's discussion is the emphasis on the local political instrumentalities in the development and the role of telephony and telegraph. Much of this was intra-state commerce, and the aldermen were, as Richard alluded to, the problem in many cases. And today, we have some echoes of what Richard was talking about in the increasingly successful effort of the cable telephone companies to get out of local regulation and at least move it to the state level. Not because the state level is less corrupt, but ironically because the state level is easier to control than the municipalities who tend to be the good guys in current parlance. So that part is different, because everything that we're dealing with in the current policy debates is interstate and national and international in scope, and that is a major difference. What strikes me as the same is the meta message, which is politics and society have a much more powerful role than simple economics would suggest. For all of the rhetoric about obeying the dictates of the marketplace, the system is gamed that way. And then the other difference, which I can put in many differences, but and similarities, but one thing that I want to focus on was, in many ways, and again, Richard alluded to this more in his discussion of the telegraph to the telephone, but it was, the book describes it with the telephone as well, is it was basically the large business users who coalesced and provided a counterforce. Today, because of the structure of our networks and because of the very universal service that was eschewed, this democratizing, everybody gets connected service. And as an aside, sorry to interrupt my own thing, but the fascinating notion that universal service was a local telephone call and a long-distance telegram was just really revelatory to me. But today, users can organize us, and I wonder, as I read this, the public was the larger public was very much out of the game, at least until you get to the 1910s. In your depiction, and the public came into the game only as this concept of actually getting a telephone in everyone's home started up. So I find those things telling, and suggest impacts on today's public policy.
Great, thank you, Andy. Very interesting. Pat, you work in the public interest community, and you've been an advocate in this area for a while, and you also work on intellectual property and rights. What lessons do you see for public interest advocates around this history?
I just think that everybody who works on communication policy and regulation should read both of Richard John's books a lot. First of all, it's really fun. Stuff happens that you cannot believe. In the middle of this book, there's a judge in a small town who rules against a competing phone company to AT&T and has their switchboard burned in the central square. And you're like, wow, you can't make that stuff up. And you should just see what happens in Chicago. Things have not changed in terms of local corruption there, as far as I can tell, in the last 150 years. But I think one of the things that is really great about tracking this history is it reminds you that there are no eternal verities here. Contingency is very important. Specific actors are very important, and there's no magic key regulatory answer that is going to always, be the best thing for all those circumstances. It's amazing from the viewpoint of people who've worked in this town on Comreg since Reagan to imagine a time when people assumed that public ownership would really be the best thing. That would be the default. From the viewpoint, I worked in '86 and '87 on the fallout from AT&T divestiture, and on new pricing mechanisms in telephony. It was astonishing to me to see positive aspects of metered service, something that we thought at the time was death to innovation and death to the public interest. And it turns out that metered service in Chicago was the gateway to expanding telephone service from the elite to the general population and creating entirely new cultural mechanisms. I think watching this interplay between the powers of government and the powers of different corporate stakeholders in shaping and changing these ideological frames that become ruling is really important, and it's really important for advocates who care about this. I do a lot of work on rebalancing copyright and encouraging people to employ fair use and any of the other mechanisms that exist in copyright to provide some balance to ownership rights. And I was recently, there's a really good book called Common as Air written by Lewis Hyde that reminds us in much the way that Richard John's work does what was the historical framework within which copyright policy was established, which is a completely different ideological frame than the one that has become standard since 1976, and particularly since 1992, when there was a very strong link established between free trade, a powerful government interest at an international level, and extreme protection for intellectual property, which was a very strong interest among large media corporations working internationally and trying to stop piracy. And the interplay between those two things created a different ideological frame that unfortunately has led a lot of people to understand copyright as being primarily about ownership. So as an advocate, you look at that, learning from the kinds of analysis that Richard John puts forward, and you say it's really important to see how emerging stakeholders could be vested in very different things than the large media companies were. For instance, the Consumer Electronics Association members and Google have a very different approach to copyright issues than the MPAA and the RIAA. It's really important to look at practice as part of the regulatory structure, and it's really important to look at rhetorical frames that are dominant. Because that's the naturalization process that Richard is talking about. There's something else that I thought was very interesting, again linked to my copyright concerns, which was the way in which government processes enabling corporate processes reinforce an ideological trope around romantic genius. You have the certification of patents creating tradable assets, patents as tradable assets. That fact creates an enormous opportunity for corporations that can claim that their inventors were geniuses, and it creates a strong impetus for them to make sure that the role of anybody else participating in the creation of invention in innovation is that record is completely stomped out of history. And when you do that, you reinforce the notion among people that all creativity and innovation is acts of individual genius, and reinforces protection for that genius, and by contrast reduces the protections for all those other people that also contribute to the process of innovation, potentially stifling innovation. So those are some of the things that I was taking away.
Very interesting. Turn to you, Sasha. Richard mentioned a little bit about municipal provision of telephone and local. I talked a lot about the local aspects. Have you any thoughts there, or more generally on his presentation?
Sure. I'll start there and then maybe move into the stuff that I just finished writing right now. But I'll point out an example, perhaps, that I think Richard would find fascinating. In my old town, before I came to D.C., I was part of a group, the Urbana-Champaign Independent Media Center Foundation. And when we were first created, turn of the millennia, we thought, one of the things that we wanted to do right off the bat is find ourselves a building, an institution, a space within our community that was in the very center to become a nexus for next-generation media and networking. It took us 5 years, but in the end we actually ended up buying our post office. And the post office became the nexus around which we started organizing this community-based independent media center. And then we started thinking, what do we do if we're an independent media center? Well, clearly we need some old media, so we had a newspaper that we founded. We created a low-power FM radio station. But we need to be thinking also about what's next. So now if you have a building and you have a radio station with a tower, for us it was natural to then start thinking about, let's build a community wireless network, an infrastructure for information dissemination that's owned and operated by the local community. So here now we have this repurposing of this post office, this integration of old media, and this expansion into this very new media that I think was a real fascinating case study that takes us from, perhaps where you start up through into the 21st century of what's possible, but what today remains almost unheard of in the United States. And so I think there's almost an untold story that spreads out from where Richard starts. And what grabbed my attention pretty immediately when he started talking was the tagline on all these advertisements for AT&T, right? This one system, one policy, universal service. And it seems to me that that's grounded in a lot of ways in this notion of there is in fact a public service component to even the most commercial of commercial endeavors. And so I wanted to share with you, a couple years ago I wrote a piece with my colleague Victor Picard on network neutrality, criteria for internet freedom. And we started it off with a quote from Theodore Vail. This is from 1907, where he says, in essence, that telecommunications should be a universal, interdependent, and intercommunicating, affording opportunity for any subscriber of any exchange to communicate with any other subscriber in any other exchange. This is like a radical notion. This is like what those of us that are claimed to be like commie pinkos on the left are calling for with internet connectivity today. And when I contrast that notion of what a company's business model and public statements are with what we hear from AT&T 100 years later. So this is a quote now from Ed Whittaker from 2006, where he says, "I think the content providers should be paying for the use of the network. Obviously not the piece from the customer to the network, which has already been paid for by the customer in the internet access fees, but for accessing the so-called internet cloud. If someone wants to transmit a high-quality service with no interruptions and guaranteed this, guaranteed that, they should be willing to pay for that. They shouldn't get on and expect a free ride." Now, 4 years ago, Ed Whittaker and AT&T were pilloried for such a notion, for this ridiculousness that we, the customers, pay once and you, the content providers, pay a second time for the same service. But when I look at the temerity of decision making of what's happening at the FCC today, you could almost take Ed Whittaker's statement, and it would be Chairman Janikowski's proposition for how the internet should be overseen and what should be allowable. It is, in fact, the AT&T business model that was so poo-pooed in 2006, but now written into law. And so what I look at when you pointed out sort of the courageousness of this frontierman, goddess bringing the telegraph across, and then contrasting that with sort of the depoliticization of science. I think we need like something new. Like what is true now? And it's like this cowardly, timid, cowering creature that's like trying to figure out internet, where we're not even talking about service anymore, right? The law of the land is talking about internet access, right? If we were to build the internet or the universal service fund today, it wouldn't be that. It'd be the internet access fund. And we'd say, well, we got, 1/4% of people have big broadband in the United States, but everyone has access to it, and that's good enough for us. And so I feel like this transformation that you begin to document up through 1920 has continued at pace, and that since 1920, we've almost retreated from what was possible and thought about and part of the business models to a point today where it would be almost incomprehensible to somebody from 100 years ago to look at what's the business models and what the policies are today as something that would be viable within a vibrant democratic society.
Thank you, Sasha. I'll turn to you now, Richard. You have plenty you might want to respond to. I'll just point to one. Andy asked about users, and they entered the picture only at a certain point, but is there some more to be said there? And then I can't but comment on the cartoons and Jay Gould and ask the question, does the mogul make the medium? Take it from there.
In the Telegraph case, the key group calling for regulation were the users, and these were the big business users. I think in at least the conventional wisdom, we talk about telegraph regulation and we'll often say, well, the populists or the farmers or the urban working class. But none of these groups really were that important or that innovative. The New York Board of Trade and Transportation, a New York-based dry goods merchants who were pretty big players, and their allies in Chicago and other big cities come to recognize after Jay Gould takes over Western Union that we need regulation. We cannot have this Mephistopheles owning and operating the telegraph network. So I think there's a lesson there. In the case of the telegraph, big users can be important in pushing for certain kinds of regulation. They weren't particularly successful, but they were the ones who were coming up with the ideas, and most of the ideas that we later associate with the populists or the Grange or other outsider groups had been pioneered by these insiders by the mid-1880s. In the case of the telephone, the user story is a bit more complicated. Those big business users, and this took me a long time to work out because it is so counterintuitive, the big business users in the 1880s and 1890s, and Pat, this gets to what you were saying, they recognized that the flat rates served them very well because, in effect, they had a Watts line, local Watts line. If you're jobbing lumber in Chicago in 1890, as a killer app for the telephone to job lumber, you're making an awful lot of calls a day, 80, 100 calls a day. And the flat rate, which could be $125, $150 a year, didn't bother you that much. What you did not want is you did not want to be forced to pay per call. You wanted to keep that flat rate. And this was a real problem for the telephone operating company managers because they recognized that there's only so much capacity in the network, and these big users are hogging the capacity with the flat rate. In other words, they're not paying their share. And by 1900, 1907, there actually are engineers, and some of these engineers are, quite prominent on the left, and they're saying exactly what the telephone company is saying, that the flat rate is being used by the big business users in order to get more than they are paying for. And that led the telephone company, in alliance with the reformers, to call for abolition of the flat rate. And predictably enough, it was the big business users that are opposed to abolishing the flat rate. And luckily, from the point of view of the operating company, I think from the point of view of the people of Chicago and New York, the city council in Chicago and the state legislature in New York permitted experiments with measured service. They didn't have to do that. They permitted innovations in the pricing plans. But it was over the opposition of the big business users. And the ideological point here is that the big business users were saying flat rate, and that's the people's interests, that we are supporting the people, where in fact they weren't. And the one place where users really got involved was in opposing the chartering of a rival telephone company in 1907. Hundreds of thousands of Chicagoans signed a petition supporting the rechartering of the Chicago Telephone Company, which is sort of surprising. They weren't coerced to do it, but they did not want to have a rival run by business groups because they felt it would increase their rates and lower the quality of service. So different from the 1880s, when the users, to a man, and they were mostly men, were absolutely furious with the Chicago Telephone Company for various reasons, and you can read about it in the book. So in the case of the telegraph, the big users were actually encouraging certain kinds of regulation to limit the power of network provider. In the case of the telephone, the big users recognized they had a good deal, and they were trying to block innovation that would expand access. And it is interesting that access is sort of the common denominator then as now. But access did involve all kinds of cross-subsidies, not only subsidies from one part of the city to another, but from city to region, and eventually subsidies to support R&D, which would become important eventually. Bell Labs is a jewel in the crown of industrial research in the 20th century, and it was largely paid for by local telephone service, and it's just remarkable how those cross-subsidies do work. Users didn't really have a voice there one way or the other. So it differs. Users can matter, but I think you can easily exaggerate the autonomy of users, especially small users, when we're dealing with these very complicated, large, capital-intensive communication networks that have their own lobbying teams that are pretty formidable.
So, Andy, I noticed you've pulled the microphone over. I'll just frame a question.
Well, I just wanted to make a technological note. As befits my age, I'm probably one of a handful of people in this room who actually lived in a home that did not have a dial telephone. And till 1954, the way one made a telephone in my home was you picked up the phone and an operator answered and you gave her, always a her, the number. So the incremental cost of a phone call in Chicago, each phone call cost because you had to have an operator placing the call with a switchboard and make all the connections. So a phone call was labor intensive and the cost per call increased. So there really was a lot of potential for free riding with a flat rate service. Today, the incremental cost of adding one more phone call is different, and that's one of the reasons why all-you-can-eat service has been popular until now, and that's the second point I'd like to make, is right now, as we speak, usage-based pricing is back, and this is a major topic that I was at the FCC talking about this morning. It is a major topic of concern, and you have the business users, Google, Netflix, Amazon, the edge companies as we call them today, who generate uploading more than downloading a tremendous amount of volume, concerned about a system that is going to have them pay by the byte. And I found a tremendous number of parallels in your discussion of that, Richard, with what's going on today.
Interesting.
Thank you.
You also asked me about the mogul makes the medium. And just answer in one sentence. They make the medium, no. They make it under constraints, and the political structure shapes the business strategy. Structure shapes strategy. Artifacts have politics. Well, politics have artifacts. In other words, if you have a particular regulatory regime, you're going to get a particular network. So I think it's very easy to exaggerate, sometimes to almost absurd lengths, the autonomy of business leaders. And this is true of a lot of the popular writing on communication networks. And as Pat, you pointed out so well, I didn't get to mention in my presentation, the genius of Morse and Bell. It's often told the telephone, the genius sprang out of Bell's head. Well, Bell became a sort of public relations poster child for AT&T. That's why we remember him. Morse became a public relations poster child for Western Union. And to continue to repeat that the key innovations are made by these solitary inventors in attics or garages, and that after they're done, nothing of consequence occurs, strikes me as bizarre and farcical, except it's the basis for any number of popular books about these media today that get wide readership. I cannot believe how a thinking audience can believe that the key innovations in the telephone came from Alexander Graham Bell and nothing happened since that, or that in the telegraph they came from Samuel Morse. There's this teams of people innovating, and those innovations, in terms of law, were becoming honored by patent law by narrowing the scope of inventions, you know. And I think if that's one takeaway here, it's not garages or attics that these networks that become innovations that make a difference. That's not where they're going to remain, and those are not the key figures. The key figures are the innovators, who are often pretty big business players.
So before I turn to Pat, Ali, if you get ready for the mic, we'll take questions from the audience. But Pat, you had something to say.
No, I actually just wanted to put a footnote on what Richard said, which is that most COM textbooks for the COM 101 course do this inexcusably. Mm-hmm. I understand why the guy writing the popular historical novel is doing it, but it is a sad fact about the communications discipline that this has been absorbed. This mythology has been absorbed and has repercussions. Has repercussions far beyond understanding that. It has repercussions for understanding just how anything happens.
Right. I mean, the moguls are often egomaniacs, and they have, publicity machines, and they've got public relations, and they've got magazines willing. So why must scholars repeat that? Why do we have to fall into AT&T publicity in writing history? Why can't we divorce ourselves from that? I find that hard to understand.
Oh, thank you. Got a question from Mark back there.
Thanks. It's Mark McCarthy from Georgetown. It was a great presentation and really good discussion. I two quick questions. One, after the Bell patents expired in the 1890s, there was this period of competition,
right,
and as many as 10% of the country had to have two telephones to communicate with everybody. And one of the independent guys said, why not have two telephones? We have two ears, right?
Yeah.
But it ended, and the normal story that people tell about that is that it was because of Theodore Vail's clever plan in 1907, right, where he decided to interconnect the long-distance network with the non-competing local telephone networks. And that created network effect advantages for the Bell system, and that's what led to the process of acquisition and so on. I like your comments on that. I know the book deals with that sort of issue, and I'd love to hear your reaction to that. The second one is a response to Andy's. The diseconomies of scale that were present in the early telephone network were basically switching diseconomies of scale, because an extra person meant an exponentially large number of connections you had to manage. Mm-hmm. And that basically got resolved through electronic switching, which didn't come into play until much later on, but it created a reason to, instead of having telephone policy emphasize access, what you wanted to emphasize was usage, and that's why flat rate plans seemed to be more attractive after you'd solved the access problem. And the diseconomies of scale were solved by electronic switching. So these are both questions that I think you probably have a lot to say, and I'd like to hear your views.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, there's a lot of argument in the book, and I couldn't present it all, and I actually was kind of favoring the parts of the argument that you could show visually. Vail in 1907. The traditional story is as you describe it, and in fact, it's often popular writers today talk about this conspiracy between Vail and J.P. Morgan to destroy the independents, and that was terrible, and if only they hadn't goodness knows we'd all be in telephone nirvana. In 1907 is a key year for telephone because independents failed to finance a rival to Bell in Rochester, and that's largely due to independent financial problems. The dot-com boom was helpful for me in thinking about early telephone business, especially independent telephone business, because a lot of them are financed on a very flimsy method. Not all, but a lot of them. After 1907, it's virtually impossible for them to get capital. It's nothing to do with Vail, nothing to do with J.P. Morgan. Also in 1907, Chicago Telephone Company gets its new charter, and that really signals that the two-telephone model is not going to work in big cities. Vail is very concerned. Vail is the president of AT&T. He comes in 1907. He is backed by the New York bankers. He's also backed by first-generation telephone managers who remember him as he'd been important in the 80s. He'd been gone for 20 years. And what he does is he tries to appease the independents, in part by selectively offering access. He's not going to be as interested in preventing access as his predecessors had been, and that angers some of the independents because they recognize that, in effect, access competition, as it's come to be known, could be a competitive advantage, and this is all kind of inside baseball politics of telephone. But what Vail is really concerned about is the financing of these independents, because there's constant political pressure for regulation if independents are about to go under. It's not Bell that's in trouble in 1907. The operating companies are generating lots of revenue. It's the independents, and we've got to try to find a way to put them on a sounder financial footing. And if Bell, and the problem for Vail and for AT&T, not the operating companies, but AT&T, is if they buy up independents in order to save them financially, that will trouble other independents who fear that end of musical chairs, they're going to be left without a seat. And this is an almost insoluble political problem because the independents are desperate to be bought up, but if you buy them up, you get yourself into political trouble. And that leads Vail and his counterparts in Bell headquarters in New York to really push for some sort of a regulatory solution to straighten out independent finances. I don't mean to disparage the independents. The independents have an important manufacturing branch because before 1907 it was impossible for them to rely on Bell, Western Electric equipment. They do pioneer the dial-up telephone, automatic electric, also in Chicago. But for the most part, they're using equipment that Bell had been developed under the Bell patents in a previous generation, and it was the equipment manufacturers that were making the money. You can make a fortune by selling telephone equipment. You could lose a fortune by running an independent telephone operating company, and that was the dynamic. And I talk about it more. But no, I do not believe that Vail single-handedly turns around the telephone business in 1907. Certainly the trade press didn't believe that at the time. In long-distance telephone, that is to say, New York, San Francisco, or New York, Chicago, those very long-distance lines are not the big money makers. The big money makers are the cities. Switching costs. Yes, I do not want to. Make a universal statement here about switching costs. And if you are a telephone user in Chicago in 1910, and you're paying a nickel in the slot, that is to say, you're paying a nickel a day, it's sort of like a flat rate. It's a guarantee. You have to pay $1.50 a month, which is incredibly low. I mean, that would be, $18 a year compared to $125 or more for the flat rate just a mere 10, 20 years before. But you can, if you want, shift over to a calling plan in which you will get a certain number of calls for free. It might cost you a little bit more than the $18 per month within a certain calling area. There were neighborhood exchanges. So the point I'm making here is that there were a variety of calling plans to accommodate residential users because they're not the problem. The problem is not the housewife or the child making telephone calls. The problem are the businessmen and the office clerks who are, as you say, because of the economics of it, because it's all manually switched, literally clogging the lines. And that's the problem that telephone managers at that time perceived. In fact, another reason the telephone users do not want to expand the size of the network in addition to their just concern about preserving their own prerogatives, is they fear it's going to degrade the level of service because they're fearful that the operators, who they more or less monopolized, are now going to be having to concern themselves with the small users. So there's a great degree of selfishness here with the flat rate at that particular moment in time and that particular technological configuration. But if you wanted, in effect, a flat rate for residential service, you could get it. You just have to pay a little bit more than the nickel a day. And the nickel a day was absolute cheapest, and it was that if you look at the numbers, users, third, half of the telephones, that was seen to be adequate for a large part of the city. So I think that gets to your two questions. I don't mean to disparage Vail as a manager. He's a very capable manager. It's just that he's operating within a very specific political economy, and that his vision of what to do with the telephone is grounded in this 19th century civic mandate for communications that comes out of his working experience in the post office and his own conception of what the mandate of the founders was. And that is very different from just treating him as a sort of genius who springs from nowhere and wants to monopolize everything in the public good. He was constrained in ways, I think, that it's easy to understate.
So I promise we close around 4:30, but before we move to sort of a closing comment from the panelists, and I'd like to sort of anchor those comments perhaps in how do they think we can get to telephone nirvana, possibly. Are there any questions? The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi there. One subtext, or one possible subtext of your political cartoons, is a suggestion of a great deal of political salience for the issues that you were talking about at the time. Mm-hmm. And I guess I have a few questions. One, is that a proper reading?
Good question.
Or, are these limited to technical journals, or were these sort of in the press? Two, were the issues broadly salient, or was it just because the press was interested in these issues for very direct personal reasons? Three, were the issues salient on their own, or were they only salient sort of in the larger context of concern about the robber baron economy and the rise of industrial capitalism and so on? And then fourth, sort of how does the level of political salience during that time, do you think, compare to the level of broad interest today in issues like net neutrality and the Comcast-NBC merger and so on?
Yeah, those are really good historical questions. And in the case of the Telegraph, I'll put it this way. There were reformers, Gardner Green Hubbard being the most prominent among them, best known to us today as a founder of National Geographic, as a Hubbard Hall, who, for various reasons, were very angry at Western Union and got on a crusade for what became known as quote-unquote postal telegraphy in the 1860s and 1870s. And I've tried to read the popular press, a good deal of the popular press, keyword searches, as well as the business press, and this did not have much resonance in the 1860s and 70s. It was basically Hubbard and a small group of allies. So the issue was not one, I'd say, that had widespread concern, didn't get onto party platforms. In general, if you asked labor leaders, let's go with anti-monopoly, that seemed good to the farmers too. We don't need regulatory outcome. January 1881, when Jay Gould takes over Western Union, it really changes. And it becomes of intense concern to the business press and to mainstream magazines. The two magazines that I featured, Puck and Judge, I was trying to think of what they'd be like today. The best I can do is kind of like Jon Stewart and Colbert. Okay, these are for the smart set. These are magazines that are very influential. The business leaders are reading them. They're also reading the New York Daily Graphic. They're commenting on the cartoons. And they do help to set a nationwide agenda if you follow editorial content around the country. But the real lightning rod was a Gould, and that transforms it. Before that time, between 75 and 81, it's mostly certain editors who are troubled by Western Union. But again, one reason you don't have more press coverage between 1866 and 1875 is that the New York Associated Press newspapers have cut a deal with Western Union not to have negative coverage of Western Union. And that matters too. And some of those contracts do exist. Would there have been a more popular outrage? Certainly the president of Western Union thought so. Is it just the hatred of robber barons? Well, these cartoons are helping to create the image of the robber baron. I mean, Gould is the archetypal robber baron, and his control of Western Union, even more than his control of the railroads, was seen to be the greatest masterstroke of the entire robber baron era. How does it compare in salience to the issues today? It was certainly more personalized then. I think Gould was better known, his physiognomy, than almost any business leader today, and it did make its way onto the national party platforms. Was the rallying cry of postal telegraphy is widely known as net neutrality today? Hard to say, but it's certainly, by the election of 1844, election of 1888, it was an issue that both parties felt that they had to take cognizance of in their public pronouncements. Yeah.
That's interesting. So, Andy, I'll turn to you for any closing comments you might have. Are we yet to see the election of 1884 in the modern day, in the way telephone issues? And perhaps any comments on Sasha characterized regulation as rather weak at the moment. Any thoughts from that yourself?
Well, I think one of the takeaways from the book, I think, is that, again, as I said before, the dominance of the political and social influences on these developments, I think there's an ebb and flow. And one of the lessons here is that over time these things come and go in terms of public involvement, political pressure, who the dominant players are, the role of competitors, their ability to come in and leverage the system. So the lessons that I take away here is that this is an inevitably a political process, and the lesson for individuals and activists is you have to play the game. You cannot sit back and be passive, otherwise you're going to be very unhappy with the outcome. I do have a couple other random thoughts of a methodological nature, really, to Pat's point about how much fun this book is and how interesting it is. Richard is the first person who has written a history based on the archives of the phone companies. And to some degree, if I have this right, this was at the beginning of the book, and there was a lot of stuff towards the end that sort of filled my brain. But basically, this was a function of the 1984 divestiture that all the records wound up getting centralized in Texas, and they were there to be viewed. My thought is, on the one hand, today, the internet, as we all know, is written in permanent ink. Nothing goes away. Not that picture on Facebook with the beer bottle. And there is so much more out there in the cloud for future historians, but indeed so much more so, and not organized the way these meticulous records appear to have been organized, that searching and doing the kind of historical work that Richard has done may not be possible in the future. And writing the history of Google may not be possible. And certainly the history of Facebook suggests that it takes on a lot of fictional and artistic license in order to try to get a history, even of something that's just happened a few years ago.
Pat, any takeaways? Any thoughts?
3 words. Politics have artifacts. 3 great words.
Sasha?
So if you've read Richard's first book, Spreading the News, you touch on this right at the beginning of your talk, where you say, like mail was kind of conceived and thought of as a universal right. It predicated what it meant to live in America. It was a unique endeavor that we engaged in. I know from this book, at one point it was like, 3/4 of the entire federal government, the employees were the post office. It was really incredible. And looking at, the vision, the popular visioning of what the telegraph was, right? You had the goddess following the frontiersmen and bringing education and communication. It was the foundation for civil society. And today with the internet, I feel like, well, this is clearly of that order. And I do worry that sometimes we might kind of not be paying attention to the lessons of previous eras. And if we don't pay attention to those lessons, the parallels are incredible. They are there for anyone to pick up and see. And if we don't pay attention to the outcomes of failed policies, or successful policies for that matter, we are destined to relive the problems that have existed in previous times. And so when I think about what are decision makers doing today, the fact that in 2 weeks we're going to have perhaps one of the most fundamentally important decisions on 21st century communication that we have seen in a generation, and very few people are paying attention to that. I look back and I say, oh my God, what are we going to do today, and what's it going to mean for my kids and the future of our communications environment?
So, Richard, what does it mean?
First, just a comment about the source base to clarify. In the case of Western Union, the collapse of Western Union in the 1980s made accessible the letter books of the presidents of Western Union, which was saved by a very intrepid group of Smithsonian archivists. And it's to the federal government and the Smithsonian archivists in particular that we owe that remarkable collection of documents. It would have been trashed had that been the case. In the case of the telephone, I don't mean to give the impression that no one has worked in telephone archives before. A whole generation of scholars, beginning with the breakup of the Bell system in 1984, worked in the AT&T archive in Warren, New Jersey. And not surprisingly, you got a particular story if you worked in that archive. You got a top-down story about R&D, long distance, managerial acumen from New York, because that archive only contained those records. And that had been what the FCC investigation was based on in the 1930s. A lot of the 1930s histories came out of that. And that was what this post-1984 scholarship was based on. In other words, it was not, for the most part, operating company history. It was the history of AT&T, and that led to a monolithic view of telephone, emphasis on Vail, emphasis on R&D, long distance, innovations in accounting, and the like. That's that archive in Warren, New Jersey. The operating companies, they're largely middle-aged engineers who were very proud of their operating companies, have been keeping what we now would call the Baby Bell archives in many different places. There were some in California, in Illinois, in St. Louis, in Indiana. And because of the churning, the same churning that led to the collapse of Western Union, that churning led to the consolidation of these archives, first in Chicago and then in San Antonio, where they were opened up, the auspices of AT&T. And it's very much to the credit of the present-day AT&T that they've made the investment in gathering those archives and in making them accessible, because it makes it possible to have a much fuller, more realistic understanding of the telephone business. 98% of all telephone calls before the Second World War were intrastate, and in 1920, even higher percentage were inside the city. The average distance of a telephone call in Chicago, any telephone call in 1905, was about 3 miles. What's so bizarre is that the histories of the telephone have been told by historians using what they thought were the main archive, the Warren, New Jersey AT&T archive, which was actually not the main archive, the operating company archive. And the AT&T archive in New Jersey had been established and attention lavished on because it was used to help make the AT&T case in their various legal struggles. And we need to go beyond that to tell the story. But just in terms of kind of a takeaway for us today in 2010, if I were to be honest in looking back on the political struggles I would conclude that it's not great popular uprisings that have been consequential in shaping the policy concerning postal, telegraph, or telephone. But there are groups of interested parties often who can mobilize various publics who do have their eye on the ball and whose interests are not always aligned. And that if there's one word that it seems to me salient in understanding the civic mandate, is that if the government is not going to have ownership, operation, control, then we'd better keep alive this vision of anti-monopoly. We'd better recognize that concentrated power that is not under regulatory umbrella is dangerous. The founders understood it to be dangerous. It's not in keeping with American tradition, and we therefore have an obligation to recognize the salience of this 19th century anti-monopoly tradition, which helped to create the extraordinary flourishing of innovation, the entrepreneurial hothouse of the 1870s that gave us the telephone, electric light, phonograph, and broadband. And that it may well be that hiding behind anti-monopoly is this idea of certain kinds of separation between, however defined, between different players. And that is one way, perhaps in our age, to keep this vision of anti-monopoly alive. Can it be manipulated? Yes. Has it been manipulated? Yes. You saw the story of Telegraph, how Jay Gould got control as the anti-monopolist of the nation's telegraph network. But the idea we can have these vast networks that affect our everyday lives and not believe that they should be regulated in the public interest strikes me as almost un-American, and it certainly would have seemed so to the founders of the Republic.
So thank you. On that note, I'd like to close this event, and thank you all for attending. I hope you found this historical and these historical lessons as interesting as I found them when I read the book. If you'd like to join us at the back, there is wine and or there's wine, and I think maybe some cheese. The cheese is outside, and ask you to please join me in thanking both our panelists and Richard John for the rich and thought-provoking discussion.